Well, as we mentioned, the Greens leader Bob Brown is giving a news conference on the expected decision by the Remuneration Tribunal to boost politicians' pay. That press conference is taking place in Hobart. Let's cross live there now.
They've handed the power to grant parliamentarians extra money right across to the Remuneration Tribunal and removed the need for Parliament to vet that through regulation and to debate it. This is simply the Labor and Liberal parties removing the embarrassment factor. There will be people who will argue that parliamentarians deserve to be paid more, particularly those who work hardest. There will be those who think, like I do, that parliamentarians are very well paid in Australia if you compare us with other countries. However, the fact that that's not now seen to be a matter for parliamentary debate shows how the big parties have debased this system. They can debate everybody else's salaries. We have nurses and teachers and police and Defence Force personnel, a whole range of people wanting public servants as a whole, wanting changes to their salary base, and these become matters for vetting by Parliament, and certainly Parliament from time to time changes the way in which those matters are determined. But it is our responsibility to justify to the electorate, to the taxpayers, the remuneration for MPs. One thing I agree with Tony Abbott on, or he's come to agree with the Greens on, is that the gold card system should go. We've been campaigning against that for a very long time, and it should go. I also think, in the reverse, that the other parties than the big parties and crossbenchers who have duties equivalent to ministers or shadow ministers should, in a cost-neutral way, be getting some of the benefits flowing to the opposition shadow ministers. I don't think there should be any extra burden on the taxpayers through that, but that's not being looked at by the Remuneration Tribunal so far as I know.
I understand the Remuneration Tribunal is yet to decide on this issue.
That's the issue of parliamentarian salaries. That may be the case, but whatever they decide ought to come to the Parliament. It won't, because Labor and Liberal voted down Parliament's responsibility for that. They voted it away through legislation earlier this year.
But doesn't having the tribunal mean that there is no question about whether or not it's independent, so that parliamentarians aren't debating on their own pay rises?
I've never felt that the tribunal was independent of political knowledge. But that said, yes, the tribunal was set up to make determinations at arm's length, but then Parliament has to take the responsibility for endorsing the tribunal's findings. What's happened in the past, and notably Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, dropped a recommended pay rise for MPs during the last global economic downturn because it didn't look right. It wasn't right that MPs were getting a sizable flow-on or increase in their salaries at a time when we were going through the spectre of a depression in Australia. That was a good move by Kevin Rudd. The Greens endorsed it, and since then things have changed. That ability by the Prime Minister or the Parliament to say no to future pay increases has gone out the window, because MPs didn't like that. So they found a neat way of saying, don't blame us, blame the Remuneration Tribunal. So they've shed responsibility for a pay grab, even regardless of what the circumstances are.
Are the proposed pay rises, do you feel, excessive?
I think that we are very well remunerated. I had heard that the electoral allowances, which the Greens always put into the electorate, we have special accounts for that, were going to be incorporated into pay rises because lots of MPs use those electoral allowances as personal income as well. Now, maybe that's not going to happen any longer, and what will happen is that we keep the electoral allowances and get a pay rise. I think these things need being kept in check, and I think the Parliament is the only real way in which you can keep that in check. There's no appeal to what the Remuneration Tribunal is determining, except the Parliament. And now the big parties have removed that appeal mechanism because they found it embarrassing. Well, come on. That's our duty. It's our responsibility. And if we're embarrassed by potential increases in income, then we shouldn't have them. That's the duty of Parliament to decide, but it's been taken away.
What about the argument that we need to pay politicians more so we attract the right people? And you look at the Polly's salaries compared to, say, Alan Joyce at Qantas, are insignificant.
Well, you're comparing the politician salaries with Alan Joyce at Qantas or Mr Morris or other people who are getting multi-million-dollar salaries. The Greens' position there is very strong, that there should be a lid put on those salaries going to CEOs. We're in a country where the gap between rich and poor is growing, as it is around the world. And we stand for social fairness. Free enterprise, let CEOs be well paid. But parliamentarians are well paid, and I think our job is not to compare ourselves with what's Kevin Rudd again called obscene salaries of some of the big bank executives, for example, but with what hard-working teachers or senior echelons in the Defence Forces, the police force, the nursing profession, for example, are getting. They work very hard, so do we. That's the sort of level we should be comparing ourselves with.
Given the budget cuts announced this week, should politicians be getting a pay rise at all?
Well, it's a very good question because Parliament's debated the budget cuts and it debates many other things, but there won't be a debate on whether the politicians should get their salary increase. But here we've got an estimated 3,000 public servants losing their jobs, or jobs being lost, because of a decision by Parliament. But up comes, in the wake of that, an added cost to the taxpayers, a budget increase, and there's no debate, because it happens to be MPs' salaries. That's a double standard.
Well, just on that, those rises will flow through to Tasmanian MPs, and given the massive budget cuts to health and other services, what would you like our politicians here to do?
Well, it's up to them to determine that as well, and that includes a parliamentary debate about it. One thing I hope the Tasmanian Parliament doesn't do is follow Canberra and have no debate available, no mechanism for an effective debate on putting a lid on salary increases. That should be available to the Premier. It should be available to the Parliament. They should not follow Canberra, the big parties in Canberra, who have said, oh, we're embarrassed by that, so we won't do it. We won't look at our own salaries. We'll give it to the Remuneration Tribunal in the hope, which appears to be being fulfilled, that we'll get a lot more money but won't have to answer for it.
Should there be perhaps a performance-based system where their remuneration is based on the impact their policies and their actions have had on the country? You can't sensibly, it's been looked at as a performance-based system. There'd be radical changes in the Parliament. I can tell you some of the deadwood and the big parties would be getting much lower incomes than they're getting at the moment, and some of the harder working people elsewhere in the Parliament would be getting much more. But there should be a vetting of what happens. The ultimate vetting system on parliamentary performance is the ballot box each 3 years. I might add here we've got the extraordinary situation of the opposition's so-called audited costs of their election promises at the last election having been found not to be audited at all. Now that is such a serious matter. The biggest lie of the last election turns out to be an avid hockey lie that their expenses were audited, when we find that's not the case at all. It's a very serious matter, and it requires Tony Abbott to explain it and to say why he shouldn't be seen as having told the biggest lie at the last election and deceived the Australian people in this way.
Your colleague Chris Christine Milne said on Twitter that a boomerang's come back to hit them after being so critical of Julia Gillard's change of mind on the carbon tax.
Well, as Christine Milne says, it is a boomerang. They've accused other people of lying, and now been found out in a incredibly serious deception of the Australian people. That is, that their costings were audited, where in fact a commission has found that they weren't. You might say too late, but surely we, the voters, deserve to be better informed by a coalition that says it wants to be in government, not to be deceived in an important fashion like that.
On the ALP conference, what do you think of Chris Bowen trying to tie the Malaysia deal with increased refugees intake?
Well, what he's done here is take the humanitarian side of the Greens policy, which is for 20,000, an intake increase to 20,000 of refugees to this great country, but put a penalty clause in there to punish people who don't come in the approved fashion, who risk all to try to get here from whatever desperate circumstances they're fleeing. It's not acceptable policy making. It's a grab all policy option, taking from the Greens' humanitarian position and the opposition's quite cruel asylum policies and trying to meld them together and saying, hey, I've got the answer. Well, it's not, Mr. Bowen. We should be processing asylum seekers in this country, and we should increase the number, as you say, to the Greens' recommended level of 20,000.
So, to the pay rise for a second, will you yourself or any of your Greens federal colleagues be in line for this pay rise? And if you are, will you be making a stand on it?
Well, I assume that if the pay rise flows through, it will go to the Greens. And I can tell you what I've always said about this. We won't be giving that back to the Labor Party to spend in whatever way they will. We will spend it in a continued delivery of the good green options to the electorate. We oppose the proposal that this should not be debated in Parliament, and we've frequently taken action on it in Parliament. But that said, if the Parliament then determines, or in this case now, Parliament's decided, the big parties have decided to not have the responsibility but simply take the pay settings, then of course the Greens will respond to that responsibly by ensuring that that money is well spent in the interests of the electorate.
So any other rise you personally receive, you'll put back into your electorate?
I will use in the best way I can to carry out my job. That's right.
The other big issue that's looming at Labor's National Conference is marriage equality. Do you think the Prime Minister will get a rude shock about just how strongly her party feels about this?
I don't understand Julia Gillard. How could a 2011 Prime Minister of Australia be stuck in 1911 when it comes to equality in marriage? How can she be swimming against the stream of her own party, let alone the great majority of the Australian people? You know, leadership requires you being up there in social change as well as economic and environmental and other changes. But she's swimming against the tide. The Prime Minister needs to catch up. She should be taking a leadership role here in bringing equality to marriage, not trying to close doors on it.
And do you think, just on the same issue, do you think the news out of Queensland and civil unions is significant?
It is a breakthrough in Queensland. It's just a pity that Anna Bligh didn't take the lead there. She had the numbers and ability to move to marriage in Queensland. There's been a resolution led by Greens leader in the Tasmanian Parliament in favour of equality of marriage. It needs to be followed up now by legislation that actually does give equality in marriage through one of the state or territory parliaments if we're not going to get it through the national parliament. But it's on its way. The good thing about this is as inevitable as the sun coming up tomorrow morning. There will be marriage equality in Australia, as there is in Canada and South Africa and Catholic Spain and so on. It's coming. The question is how long Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott can hold it back. They're leaders out of touch with their nation.
To the intergovernmental agreement, the draft of Professor West's verification report was due today. It won't be delivered today, and there's no timeline for it. What's your reaction? I have a serious, I underline that word, dispute with Prime Minister Gillard over this matter. She signed on the 7th of August to say that logging would stop immediately in the 430,000 hectares of high conservation value forest. And a compensation mechanism was put in place if logging were deemed to have been required, even though it had stopped. She's written to me to say that the Tasmanian government has carried out its obligation under that agreement to put that 430,000 hectares into informal reserves. That's established. So what we have now is broad-scale logging continuing in reserve forests, reserved for their high conservation value. This is a serious breach of a written agreement by the Prime Minister and the Premier of the public intergovernmental agreement. Every day, their word on that document is being clear-felled by the logging activities of Forestry, Tasmania, and the others involved in the catamaran forests, in the Picton forests, in the Styx, the Weald, and elsewhere. I cannot understand. I've spoken to the Prime Minister about this a number of times, but I cannot understand how she can allow her word to be trashed by the logging going on in these magnificent World Heritage Value forests in Tasmania now. It must stop.
All right, that's where we're going to leave Bob Brown's press conference in Hobart. He's been speaking largely about some of the big issues that are expected to dominate the ALP National Conference taking place this weekend, among them refugee policy on gay marriage, on which he said Julia Gillard was stuck back in 1911. He also took aim at the expected changes to politicians' pay and entitlements. He says Australian politicians are comparatively well paid. He said the decision to raise salaries in exchange for MPs giving up perks should have been debated by Parliament. Senator Brown also said it would be unrealistic to move to a performance-based system, saying it would be bad news for the deadwood and good news for harder-working MPs. And we've been asking your opinions about that particular story on poly pay rises on the ABC website this morning, and as well as on Twitter and Facebook. And there's been a mixed reaction. Natalie Hayman's questions whether money saved through cutting the Gold Pass scheme for ex-MPs could go. She suggests childcare, hospitals, schools, police and transport. But Tommy Tudorhope writes the poly pay rise is well overdue. Let's just hope, he says, a higher salary attracts some better talent on both sides. And on Facebook, Nicola Stratford writes, so often the workers outside these privileged jobs lose both their pay rises and their perks. She asks, in what way is the pay rise tied to the CPI? Do they have to negotiate with a boss or even with us as the electorate?